So we've been in First Corinthians for some time now. And we're not going to be out of it anytime soon, all right? But the general subject or the theme that brings this whole letter together is this issue of how grace transforms the church. And I've been saying repeatedly that God's purpose in reconciling people to himself is not just so that individuals can have a relationship with God and that those individuals can be forgiven. All right, so it's also true that it has the purpose to create a body of believers who live as God's hands and feet on the earth. So they are, that group of people are his presence here. And they're accomplishing together, building the supernatural life of the Spirit that is God's intent for his people in general. All right, and it's the community that becomes the salt and light to the world. All right, that is their mission. So when Paul's talking about the difficulties that this group in Corinth is facing, it's important that they get these things straightened out because the stakes are so high. Okay, God does his work in the world through his church and through his people. And therefore, we need to be instructed, not just as individuals, but as a group, in what it looks like to be the kind of people that God has called us to be. And for the last month or so, before our little break, we have been talking about sex in one way or another. And this morning, we're going to shift to talking about freedom. And then there's going to be other issues that we'll touch on. And all of these things really are the key issues that are the meeting places between what God is wanting to accomplish in the lives of his people and the social situation that these people are coming out of. So what we're finding in this very practical and very specific letter about very personal issues is like the foundation for transformed people to be in a transformed community that can, over time, transform entire societies. So historians have actually noted that it is the biblical church that influenced the Roman Empire, and then by extension, influenced Western civilization into really taking seriously ideas like equality and women's rights and marriage being a partnership and other stuff like that. So these things are just fundamentally different than both the Jewish and the Gentile backgrounds of the ancient world. And so a great many of the social advances that we have today are rooted in this basic teaching that books like First Corinthians make really clear. Okay, so I just think it's important for us to see that what we're reading here this morning is really a set of truths that have already rocked and transformed the world. Okay, and they can continue to do that as the gospel takes root in people's lives. And so, as I said, what we're getting into this morning is this idea of freedom. And Paul's going to talk about this in chapter 8 and in chapter 9. So this is a super important topic, and it's a revolutionary idea for the time. So the movement of the early church through the Roman Empire was undeniably a revolution of freedom. And so this morning, we look specifically at the relationship that freedom has with conscience. And next time, we're going to talk about a few other dimensions that freedom has that Paul gets into in chapter 9. So verse 1 of chapter 8 gives us the context. We're going to look at that first. It says, "Now concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. So this is the circumstance that Paul's interacting with. In this ancient world, there are plenty of Christians that have come out of backgrounds that were not Jewish. They're pagans. They believed in the existence of many gods. And they worshiped those gods, and they sacrificed to their idols in the many temples that were all over the Roman Empire. And so then these people are meeting Christ, and they're coming into these Christian communities, and it's raising questions about the appropriateness of even eating this meat, knowing that it has already been sacrificed to a false god. And in the major cities in the Roman Empire, including Corinth, most of the good meat had already been sacrificed to one of these deities and then sold later on the market. And this issue raises a couple questions of conscience for these people. And so we're going to talk about two big problems that come up in this issue. And the first one is this seemingly ridiculous question of what is a steak? Okay, so this is a question that has quite a bit more to it than it seems like it does. And then the second question that we want to address is what is it that we do as a group when some of the people in our group have a conscience that has not quite caught up with their understanding or their knowledge about some certain kinds of practices? So those are the situational things that we're going to examine this morning, and it is in the light of those things that Paul's going to roll out the revolutionary concept that was really unknown in the Greek and Roman worlds of freedom. And very specifically, what does freedom look like within the framework of conscience? So we go back to the first question. We're going to see that we really need to answer is, what is a steak? It's almost too much to believe, but this is actually a very serious question. All right, and it needs a well thought out answer. What is a steak? I mean, it's a piece of meat, right? And so a steak is just a group of meaningless molecules. It's just a hunk of meat. But that is a very modern and very Western way of looking at this question and what a steak might be. In other places, in other times, people may look at the same hunk of flesh that you're looking at and think that it represents like a god or something. Okay, sort of like a Brahma bull would in India. Okay, they may see an ancestor somehow with reincarnation or whatever. So eating this meat would be like the ultimate insult to their ancestors. And I'm not making light of this. Okay, this is a big deal, and it's really how some people see the situation. Okay, and so in the Roman world, they might think that the piece of meat might be some sort of sacred communion with the gods somehow. To offer this meat to the god and then ingest it somehow is like the ultimate expression of having a relationship with that god. And in that sense, eating the meat would be an act of worship to the pagan god that it was offered to. And right here's the problem that the people that Paul is talking to are having with this. So they have not yet come to understand the biblical point of view, which is that meat is a blessing from God that's intended to meet our needs and is for our nourishment and for our enjoyment. So later during this same discussion, Paul says, the earth is the Lord's and all that it contains. So the chunk of meat that's sitting in front of you is a blessing from God for you to enjoy. So go ahead and enjoy you some meat. Okay, but just saying that is not really enough. We need to dig a little bit deeper here. There's this underlying problem to address. And the root of this is fear. The fear for these guys is that by just eating the meat, they're not doing justice to something important, or maybe they're profaning something that is sacred. And in the ancient world, just like in much of the world today, like Asia and Africa and South America, the idea of sacred spaces and sacred objects is very important. Okay, there's a story from the Lords of the Earth where a little girl wanders off the path in the jungle in Asia and is seen walking through the sacred space that was set aside for the local god. And in order to solve the problem of this little girl that had profaned the sacred place and offended the local gods that protect their village, they had to get rid of the little girl. So they threw her off a cliff to her death. And the point that I'm making is that even if we can't really relate at all, this is not a trivial matter. It's not a matter of like aesthetic preferences. This gets right to the heart of the matter of how people think and the lens that they see the world around them through. They might think that this piece of meat is not just a slab of flesh, but more like a vehicle through which a believer might communicate with a God. So to eat this piece of meat, if I were not a believer in that God, then I would be defiled somehow by paying homage to a God that's not my God. Okay, and then if you've been defiled, then you would have to go back to a different temple to correctly worship the correct God and, beg forgiveness. And in this sense, all polytheistic religions are religions that have their worship rooted in fear. There's the fear of offending your God, and then there's the need to placate, and that's just how the whole deal works. And concerning meat that has been sacrificed, Paul says, we all have knowledge. And in other words, they've already had the sit down, and they've already talked this through. And he brings out the details of this talk in the following verses. Verses 4 through 6, he says, concerning eating things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there is no God but one. Even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things and we exist for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. So Paul's saying that there's really only one God. Okay, he says it over and over again, and all these so-called gods that are worshipped in these various temples are just extensions of these people's imaginations. Okay, they're just a reflection of the people's desire to understand the world around them. The gods just represent different forces of nature and other stuff like that. And Paul's saying that none of that stuff is real. There is a God that created and a God that's sovereign over everything that exists. And because that's true, these things that are being worshipped in these temples, even if they were real things, wouldn't really be God at all. And so that's what he's meaning when he says that we all have knowledge. That's the knowledge that he's talking about. He's taken these people from this background where their entire orientation to reality and their whole understanding of who they are and their whole understanding of what a God is undergoing a radical transformation. Okay, they do know, at least in part, what's true. They even sense the truth in what Paul is saying. And yet, there's still this second problem that we had up earlier. What do we do when for some of the group these matters of conscience have not really caught up with what they really do know? And what we're getting at is this question of if it is possible to know that something is true, but to feel in such a way about a thing that you think that if you pursued this way of living or behaving or whatever, then you would feel that it was wrong, even if you actually knew that it was not wrong. Okay, and so that's just the kind of problem that Paul's dealing with these people. And we're going to illustrate that just a little bit. These people that are not eating the meat that had been sacrificed to idols, they may be hungry. They may really like meat. They may smell it cooking and be salivating all over the place. Okay, they may really want some of that meat. But to eat that meat would just be so wrong. Okay, it would be such a sin against God to eat meat that had been sacrificed to some other god. Right? Or would it? And so that's kind of the process that's going on inside of these people. In verse 7, Paul says, however, not everyone understands this. For them, having been an idol worshiper, they eat food as if it were sacrificed to an actual God, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. So defiled feels like a very strong word, and very religious type of word. All right, so he's talking about and acknowledging that violating your conscience is a very, very dangerous thing to do. Okay, it's also a very dangerous thing to get used to doing. So even if your conscience is misinformed, violating your conscience is extremely dangerous and generally not a good idea. Okay, and in fact, it's in defiling conscience and the danger that comes with that people can get pretty messed up about what is even right or wrong at all and where any real authority resides anyway. And so I'm going to give you a hypothetical example of what I'm talking about. This is a real thing that happens to a lot of people, but this story is fictionalized to illustrate the point. Okay, so let's say you're born in 1925-ish in a small town in the middle of Illinois. Okay, you're raised in a church that's loudly opposed to just three things: smoking, drinking, and war. Okay, now the pacifist thing you may or may not be able to relate to, but lots of us that were raised in the church can relate to the smoking and drinking thing. Okay, we may even add playing cards or dancing or swearing or whatever. But this guy that we're talking about is a pacifist. Now, the Bible is very clear that drinking in moderation is not sinful. Okay, there are dozens of psalms extolling the virtues of wine. Jesus drank wine. Paul tells Timothy to take some wine for his ailments. So it's really, really tough to make a clear argument that alcohol itself is outside of God's will for our lives. Okay, but you guys that were raised in church of any kind know what I'm talking about when I say that sometimes that doesn't matter, all right? Each church culture has its own pet issues, and alcohol is on the list for quite a lot of churches. And so anyway, our hypothetical guy, is just the right age to be among the first men of this country to be drafted into World War II, into the Navy, where there are, issued by the government, cartons of cigarettes. And he's surrounded by hundreds of other 20-year-old men that are reveling in the end of prohibition at any chance they can get. So the new culture that he's surrounded by is a smoking and drinking culture of war. All right, and this is certainly against all of the biblical authorities that he has ever known in his life. But eventually, he takes some kind of a step, right? He smokes a cigarette. He has a drink. He enjoys his drills for combat, whatever. But there are all these feelings that come along with that. Right? There's shame, there's guilt, there's a sense of rebellion, all kinds of feelings that are associated with that new activity. And there is no amount of reasoning that can change the depth of the way that his conscience has been informed. Okay, we're talking about finding yourself in a situation where it is deviant to drink at all, and you are drinking. Okay, you're already across the line, which can remove any limits that you had. Right? There are no norms, there are no shoulds or oughts that you can apply because you're already on the wrong side of things. Okay, the sociologist researcher E. Mansell Pattison used this term Bible Belt alcoholism for situations where the very act of taking a drink violated their conscience. Okay, they're already outside of God's will and probably under his judgment. Therefore, a lot of their life plays out with feelings like they are under the judgment of God. And so they behave accordingly. Okay, our hypothetical World War II guy is constantly racked with guilt, which reinforces drunken episode after drunken episode. He convinces himself that he is beyond the possibility of redemption, which means that he refuses to even entertain conversation or any kind of engagement about spiritual matters or eternity. And so a good portion of our parents or grandparents grew up in homes where the story I just told is essentially the story of one or both of their parents. Okay, so this issue of violating your conscience is not just some interesting historical thing. This is not at all abstract. This has the power to destroy families and destroy lives and destroy the witness of the church. Okay, this is the weight of this thing that Paul is dealing with the Corinthians here. So what do we do when we encounter a person that is like this Navy guy that we're talking about, who believes against reason and has internalized into their being that something or other is just wrong? Okay. They may even be able to turn to the correct passages in Scripture that prove that these things are wrong. But in some of these cases, there's just no appealing to reason. Okay, it's way beyond that. We even have this warning from Paul that we not go beyond what is written by making matters of conscience into real moral absolutes. Okay, at some point in the late 1800s, as early evangelical Christians were involving themselves in the industrialized society of Western Europe and the United States, they began to see clearly the ravages that alcohol consumption brought to the urban workers. And they were right. Okay? Everyone saw the same thing that they saw. But their reaction was to eliminate alcohol. Okay? But that didn't deal with the problem. It just added a whole host of other problems. And that situation makes this point. Okay, if you set up some kind of an absolute about something that the Scripture does not speak that way about, then you're inviting the wholesale violation of the conscience of people in that area. And that quickly spills into other areas. And if the area where you create moral absolutes is something that the culture in general just doesn't have any real issue with, then you've created this rift and this angst in the hearts of people both inside and outside the church community. Okay, so that's what Paul's dealing with. And in the midst of this issue, he starts to talk about freedom. And if I am one of these people with the underinformed conscience, then what do I do with this idea of freedom? Okay, I may understand that this is just a piece of meat, and I may understand that the God that it was offered to never really existed. And this eating the meat thing may not even be an issue for me. All right, now I get that it's a huge hang up for you, fine, but don't go putting your hang ups on me. All right, so that's how Christians that like to embrace freedom like to deal with those that are not as far along. They're like, okay, then whatever, don't do it. Okay, we don't want to get dragged down by someone else's underinformed conscience thing. Okay, we're enlightened. We don't need to be burdened with some other person's hang-ups. And that's what's going on in Corinth. Some of the people there were becoming vegetarians. Okay, they're trying to avoid the whole discussion. They were all fighting about this issue of whether or not to eat this meat, just like Christians today fight over the consumption of alcohol or whatever other issue we bring up. And it's into that framework that Paul's talking about this whole issue of freedom in relation to conscience. And we're going to say a couple of things about this. The first thing is that these pagan people were bound to these idols that they were worshiping. All right. All idols bind us as we worship them. And the reason that I think that this is relevant to us is that the whole heart of idolatry certainly has not left mankind. Okay, Paul said this one not that far back in 1 Corinthians. He said, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Paul can eat the meat, all right? That's not really a thing for him. But he's not going to be mastered by it. That's the issue. All right? What drives what you decide to do? What's the controller of what you decide to participate in? That's what he's trying to get at with these people that he's talking to. Okay? We can talk just as easily today about the idols that bind us as we could talk about the idols that bound the Corinthians. Okay? So most of you are still at an age that you will understand a reference to Hotel California. Okay? You can check out, but you can never leave. You know what I'm talking about. And so the idea is that society is all just an open party, and you should do whatever it is that you want. All right, the Eagles are making a point about the way that human beings seem to be. We're led on by our own desires. You want something, you have the opportunity for that something, so you take it. And in a sense, that song sort of captures the essence of this idea of violating the conscience. Okay, desires are not good or bad. They're not right or wrong. They can certainly be inappropriately expressed, but desire's okay until it becomes the driving force in your life. Okay, if I just cannot say no to my desires, even when it puts me in debt, or even when it puts me in conflict in my close relationships, or even when it is unhealthy, then I've got a pretty serious problem. I'm now bound to this idolatrous elevation of my own desires. They're now the controlling influence in my life. I wonder if there's any of us that can relate to this. Okay, freedom is not defined by being able to do whatever I want. That is the most immature possible definition of freedom. Okay, real freedom is being able to say no to the desires that you have that would destroy the life that God gave you. Okay, all of us struggle gaining this kind of freedom. And for some of us, it's in very obvious ways. Okay, I went back and forth with smoking for decades. Okay, there's drugs for some of us, all right? Shoes, guns, furniture for others of us, right? We have unbridled desire, okay? And are we angry at people when they ask us about it? Okay, how's that going with your smoking thing? You said last month that you needed to get a handle on your spending. How's that going? Man, butt out. Right? Maybe you don't actually say that out loud, but you want to. Okay, you're protecting the things in your life that you have elevated to the status of God. There are other ways to think about this that may apply to us. There are the slavish norms of the culture that we live in. Okay, and it seems to me that this is very much part of the point that Paul's making to the Corinthians that he's talking to. And so, because to move out of the organized pagan temple worship and into the Christian community is a pretty visible thing. Okay, your neighbors are gonna notice that something has changed and that you're now pursuing a different course with your life. They may not understand it, but they know it's different. All right, there are these punishments or incentives sometimes that society gives to us that keep us within the framework of the norms of our society. So, as an example, like we are generally middle class and upper middle class, relatively educated group of people. And I wonder if we really interact with the question of whether or not we have real and agreed upon boundaries in our lives as they relate to our work and relate to our playtime and relate to the things that we buy and the things that impact my social status. Okay, now, there's not a single one of those things that's wrong, but they're matters of conscience for us. Those things impact our marriages and our close friendships. So, do we talk in honest terms about how much work is too much work? And sociologists tell us that today people are working far more than at any other point in American history. Okay, it is now the total norm for both a husband and a wife to work full-time jobs. And that has never been the case in the past. And there are just implications to that that have an effect on the direction of a family. And it is, of course, true that things are not always going to stay the same, all right? Things look different over time. But they do have an effect. And are we talking about this stuff inside of our close relationships? Have we agreed upon some boundaries to keep things headed in the direction that we're shooting for? All right, how much work is too much? How much out of town is too much? Are we willing to draw the line and say that, one more yoga class is too much? Are we willing to turn down the promotion or the relocation because of the implications that it will have for my spiritual life or for my family? Okay, our playing, our hobbies, our purchases are all things that are in the ballpark of being idols for many of us. And in our world, we don't go down to the temple and sacrifice meat to a random god as an act of worship. All right, instead, we go to the mall, or we log on to Amazon, or we go to Hobby Lobby to buy junk for our foyer, or we go to the motorcycle shop. Okay, we slavishly give our resources to some random god of commercialism, or of recreation, or of nesting. And just like the people that Paul is talking to, the issue that's driving this behavior is the issue of fear. Okay, fear is always at the heart of idolatry. Fear of the retribution of the god. Fear of offending the gods. And as a culture, we find ourselves living very much in fear of the idols that we worship. Okay? What keeps us in bondage to a way of living that we know makes no sense at all? That we know is completely unhealthy for us or for our family? That we know is making it very difficult for us to establish real bonds with the people around us and to grow together and to really be the body of Christ? Okay, what is it that's really driving us to keep those things, which are the most important things, at arm's length from us? Okay, just like all idolatry, it's a matter of fear. There's a fear about our identity. Okay, so what is it that makes it so that I matter at all? What is it that makes me acceptable? All right, well, you know that you matter, but you really know that you matter when the guy around the drinking fountain at work is telling you how much you matter. Or if your boss is telling you how great it is that you put in all that extra time and he's giving you a bonus. Okay, you know that you're acceptable when your neighbors are commenting on your new car or your crabgrass-free lawn. Okay, we're into those kinds of things because we're insecure about who we are, and we're in bondage because of that deep fear that we have. There are social fears. Okay, we can't take our foot off the gas of our career and choose a less aggressive path and limit our income potential, because then, like, what would people think of me? There's that fear that people will think you're a bum, that you can't make more money, or people will think that, you cannot be more powerful than what you are. That's a real fear that drives some people. We like to know that the people around us approve of us and accept us. There's a social fear that controls us. If we might deviate from the norms, even if those social norms are destructive to the things that we really should value. Okay, we just don't want the people around us to think that we're a loser. And some of us also will find, when we examine this issue, that we have suspicions about God. We're not sure that we can really trust him. The people who were eating the meat that were sacrificed to idols lived in fear of those idols. And the alternative was to trust that God was greater than whatever threat these idols presented to them. Eating the meat was really supposed to be a sign of your faith that you do get it. You do understand that these other gods are just projections of the human imagination. They're not real gods. The true God is the one that can take care of you and save you from bondage to these other gods. And so you've got to ask yourself and your conscience if you really trust God this way. Is God really good? Is God really powerful? And then sometimes when we're dealing with these kinds of problems, we're like, okay, I'm not going to eat the meat that's sacrificed to idols or whatever. But then there just doesn't seem to be anything else to eat. Okay, there are no alternatives. So maybe we see ourselves as being in bondage also. Okay, I can see the fear that drives me to the things that I elevate to the place of God in my life, but what am I supposed to do? Right? What are the alternatives? And in the lack of a tangible alternative, we're just resigned to following the path of normal. All right, we just stop thinking about it. So everybody says this. We all say that we're not all about money. Okay? We're not all about career. We all say that kids are healthiest when they're not constantly indulged in the center of the universe. Everybody says those things. Okay, you can pick any random person and ask them, and that's what they'll say. Nobody says that the real point of life is to just work. Nobody says that they're a slave to materialism or to the pursuit of status. But how do they actually live their life? Okay, they would say that you're a fanatic of religious proportions that is completely given over to this way of life. Right? The things that you say do matter, and the way that you actually live then is completely irreconcilable if what you're saying is that money doesn't matter that much, because most of us live like it does. There's a tension there that probably a great many of us in this room find ourselves struggling with sometimes. And that makes freedom, in the context that we're talking about, a freedom of conscience. You know that you're free when you're actually content with what you already have. When you can take what you have as God's blessing, and you have a demonstrated ability to bless others with the things that God has blessed you with. What's missing out of the whole equation in most people's lives is a gratitude and a sense of contentment with what you have. We have a complete addiction to have more and to be more and to do more. We constantly need more of everything. And as a culture, we're just not free if that's the way we roll. So Americans say that we value our freedom, but we have defined freedom so narrowly that we can live as complete slaves and still say that we're free. Okay, we say that freedom is the ability to determine my own course in life. So we're free to walk off the edge of a cliff. Great. Thanks. Okay, now I do believe that our American freedoms are something special and something to be cherished and protected. But they are not the same thing as the freedom that Paul's describing here. Okay, so a community that practices freedom in the Spirit through self-giving love is a community that understands and experiences freedom and that is transformed by it. And we're going to take a few minutes to describe that. This is chapter 8, verse 1. He says, now concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. All right, so that's Paul's response to these people who are saying that the other people should just get over this problem that they're having with the idol. Okay, he's saying that knowledge is not enough in this kind of circumstance. It's love that's crucial in these areas of people's conscience. And then he says, take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Okay, and I'm going to tie in with that where Paul says in Galatians 5:3, you were called to freedom. Don't turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. Okay, right there's real freedom. It's the capacity to serve other people. Okay, and Paul describes this in 3 ways. The first is that we experience real freedom in grace-based relationships. In a grace-based relationship, we can and should go to the other person and tell them that we've been harboring an attitude towards them, or that we said something about them to another person or whatever. Okay? I did this thing and I'm sorry. Or just the opposite, when someone has done something that's wrong to us. Okay, we don't pretend that it didn't happen, but we can say that just as Christ has forgiven me, just as he does not hold things over my head, I'm not going to hold this over your head. In living in grace-based relationships with other people, it is supposed to give us freedom from the self-righteousness that says that somehow I'm better than you. Okay, we can no longer say that some other person is all screwed up and I'm sure glad that I'm not like that. Okay, compared to them, I really have it together. Understanding grace doesn't allow stuff like that to enter into our heads or into our hearts. Okay, we are in conflict with people that are totally our moral equal. Okay, we're equal in the sense that we are all guilty. We all stand before God on the basis of his mercy, and we need to stand before one another the same way. Okay, if we're understanding grace in relationships and we're able to really forgive from the heart, then we have freedom from lingering anger and bitterness. Some of our lives are just defined by bitterness. Okay, people are just ready for all the sour things that you have to say about all the people and all the situations that you have around you. Okay, there's all this unresolved relational crap that just follows you around because you're holding tight to all of it. And we can be free from that by really learning to practice grace in all of our relationships. And we're then free from the self-deception that makes the claim that we're better than the people that we're in conflict with. We're free from the self-deception that says that somehow someone else's sins are more egregious to God than my sins are. And that makes us free to draw near to the imperfect people that we are all surrounded by. Do you think that the people around you, the people that you count on, will fail you? They will. Okay, people will let you down. You will feel betrayed by people sometimes. You'll feel excluded by people sometimes. You'll come to a place where you have risked your heart and trusted another person. And on a long enough timeline, they will be found unworthy of that trust. That'll happen. Okay, that's what it looks like to be in a relationship with people. They're a lot like you are. And you can go one of two ways with that. You can go straight superficial, all right, so that you don't even really know anybody and nobody really knows you. Or you can practice grace. Okay, you can recognize that you will be hurt by people and that you will hurt those same people. You can recognize their imperfections and recognize your own and draw near to them anyway, because the grace of God is a lot bigger than all of your imperfections put together. Okay, the community that practices grace-based relating, like what we're talking about, gives this incredible and biblical freedom to one another. It's freedom in areas that you could never get from a big paycheck at work, or from kudos from your boss, or from social standing, or from experiences. Okay, it's real freedom. So are you anywhere near free, like this kind of freedom that the Bible describes? That's the freedom that God is calling us to, and it's the freedom that he wants to give you. It really is the freedom to know God in a deeper way. When you release the debt that other people owe you, you're freed to experience a God that has released the debt that you owe him. Okay, I've known my whole life that my dad loves me. Okay, I had a dad that was really good at expressing that in a way that I understood. But I never really understood the real depth and the breadth of that love until I became a dad myself. Okay, I thought I understood, but I didn't. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here. You can think that you understand what God has done for you, but you don't until you live it by giving it to the people around you. Okay, you don't understand forgiveness until you forgive. And you cannot know what it costs until you pay the price yourself. And this is how you come to really understand that God loves you and has forgiven you completely. So second thing, quick, the community that practices freedom through self-giving love is a group that's going to be able to influence people effectively. All right, this is what enables us to go from a place of bondage where maybe our conscience is all screwed up about some issue. All right, it's not just knowledge that will minister to that need. There's also a love relationship that's needed. Paul says this cool thing to Philemon, all right? Philemon is Paul's friend at a church in Colossae. And Philemon was also a slave owner. And so Paul had come to know Philemon's slave and actually had brought him to faith in Christ. And Paul writes Philemon a letter about his slave. And he says, I have the right to demand you do what is proper. The Bible makes it very clear that it's not cool for one person to be the owner of another. Okay, Paul talks about this explicitly in 1 Corinthians 7. And then Paul says, but for love's sake, I appeal to you as a brother. As a brother. Right? Paul realizes that Philemon has been involved in this exploitive relationship, okay, for perhaps decades. Philemon's neighbors have the same kind of relationships with people in their houses. Okay, it's wrong, and Paul's willing to say it's wrong. But the pathway to change is appealing to one another on the basis of God's love for their good. This is always what we appeal to in another person's life. All right, they may be way off track, but we don't go and condemn them and insist that they get back in line or punish them or distance ourselves from them. We come alongside them and explain how grievous the situation is. We express our love for them and for the people that are being exploited. Okay, there's just the appeal as a brother to recognize the way of love. And this is the way that a community that's becoming free in these deep moral areas or important matters of conscience operates. And I ask this question of myself, and I am very hesitantly sharing it with you. Do people sense that you love them? If we would be able to communicate a softness to people, it would enable them to be at ease around us. They would be less defensive in areas of their conscience. They would be less willing to fight with you if they sense a softness and an approachability and a care in you for them. Okay, if they were to sense that you understand them, then it would enable you to speak with honesty about these problem areas. Okay, and so some of us are like, right on, right? We do understand what's true. But we're so hard or so aloof that no one wants to hear it from us. And that doesn't do anyone any good. And what Paul's describing here is that I can be an agent of freedom in your life, and you can be an agent of freedom in other people's lives if we can have that kind of sensitivity where people can sense that we're coming to them out of love. And we come to them in their interest and because we care for them. Are you that kind of person? Are you an agent of freedom in the people's lives around you? Last one here. So a community that's free has as the things that matter to them the circumstances of one another's lives. The focus is off of self and on the ways to it's on the ways to lift up one another instead of on the ways to lift up yourself. In Galatians 6:2, Paul says, bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. So that's what Christ was about. And that's what he wants us to do. He wants us to move toward one another and to have these conversations where we find out what the burden is that the other person is carrying. Okay, what is the thing that your friend is not free from? What is the thing that your spouse is not free from? How can you come alongside them in that and help bear that burden? How can you help them make a conscience-based decision about this thing that is in their life? And in that way, we would be fulfilling what Christ's will for his people is. Are you free to be there for people when they need you? Or are you so bound up in other stuff that it's impossible for you to be that active, contributing, life-giving member of the body of Christ? Okay, that's a big one. A lot of us have trouble with this one. I have trouble with this one. We have pretty good intentions, but we're so caught up with whatever we're doing or with whatever it is that we idolize that we just can't seem to find the time to be present when other people need us. Right? We should think about that. But that's all I have for this morning.